Okay. Welcome back, everybody, on this glorious rainy day. A day that should make you thankful for how few days we have like this compared to those suckers who live in Seattle, who try to convince themselves that it's actually better to have weather like this. We'll talk about rationalization in a couple of weeks. The one announcement I have is that the midterm is officially moving from the Tuesday that it's on to the Thursday of that same week. Okay. The Thursday lecture will be on Tuesday of that week, but it will not be on the exam. And I will not take attendance that Tuesday. So if you want to just watch the video, I understand. I can understand why you wouldn't want to get new content before the exam. And so, yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah. What? No discussion the week of the exam. That's correct. But it's actually calling on you. Yep. So you signed up potentially for two different email things. One of them was if you're interested in being a subject in fMRI studies, and there are people who run fMRI studies here, several people in my lab, and they will email that list as they need subjects, people who are interested. The other one was for people interested in being research assistants. I gave that list to all the faculty and graduate students in social psychology in the whole department. And it's really up to them whether they choose to make use of that. But for instance, in their mind, they might say, wow, this is a great list to have. I'm going to contact those folks 10th week to get RAs for next quarter. So, they might use it in all sorts of different ways. Yeah. All right, any other questions before we get back to business? The review sheet you will get before the review session. But probably only a day before. But I should let you know, if memory serves, the review sheet is only going to focus on what you need to know from section, in terms of what you need to know from the books you're reading for section, and from the last week when you did the demo in class. It'll tell you what things you need to know from section for the exams. In terms of the lectures, there isn't a review sheet for that. Everything's fair game, and you get it in PowerPoint, audio, video. I make house calls. Any of you own houses? No? Okay. No, one. Okay. So now I have to make good on that. All right. Anything else? No. All right. So when we left off last time, we were talking about how if you prime people with words related to the stereotype of the elderly, but not words like slow, you get people to walk more slowly. If you prime people with hostile or polite, you get people to behave in a more hostile or polite fashion. Okay. Just want to show you, I think, just one more example from this line of work. This is a study by Op Diesterhuis in Amsterdam. He's about 6'5" and has bright red dyed hair. He looks like he's a real punk in the positive sense, not the negative sense. Yes. Right. Okay. So I'll make a comment about this now. So she said you need to know names, dates, and so on. So you definitely should be able to spell Diesterhuis because who can't spell that? No. So dates are really irrelevant. Names are only relevant in the sense that I might put a name on an exam as something to help you remember a study. But I will never say, what did Lee Ross do in 1977? Right? Or in what year did Tom Gilovich do the study on the 60s versus the 80s band? What I might say is, in 1977, Lee Ross ran a study in which he did the following things. Okay? What would have happened if he had added this condition to that study? Okay? So there, Lee Ross is just, if that helps you, that's great. But you absolutely, if you understand the concepts, would be able to answer it without knowing the names. The only exception to this, the only exception is in the lecture that follows. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this. Then we have the real lecture for today, which of course we won't get all the way through. The lecture that comes next Tuesday will have philosophers involved. Okay? You will need to know the philosophers' names because there's really no other way to identify what they're talking about. But that's the only lecture where you will actually need to know names. All right. So in this study, okay, they had people taking a general knowledge test, essentially answering questions like, who painted this painting? Does anyone know who painted? Picasso, right? What's the capital of Bangladesh? Anyone? Yeah, I have no idea. I wasn't very good in geography. What? C? A? F? Okay, it doesn't matter. This is a psychology class, not a geography class. But that will be on the exam. The key thing is that before they took this test, they either spent 5 minutes thinking about the day in the life of a professor or the day in a life of a supermodel, okay? Or they didn't do either of those two thinking tasks. Then they took the general knowledge test, and lo and behold, they did better on the test if they had been thinking about a day in the life of a professor, and worse if they had been thinking about a day in the life of a supermodel, which I would warn you then not to watch America's Next Top Supermodel, except nobody on that show ever actually becomes a supermodel, so you're safe. All right. So there's all these examples of these primes doing what seem to be really amazing things, changing behavior that, it's hard to imagine why thinking about a professor would make you do better on a math test. To be perfectly honest with all of you, I still don't understand how that one works. That one just seems because aren't these people trying hard? Like suddenly you think of a professor and it's like, oh yeah, now I know the answer to the capital of Bangladesh. Like it was either there or it wasn't. Oh yeah, they've been replicated. So anything that seems surprising gets replicated because a bunch of people don't believe it. And then when they all find it, they go, oh, I guess, yeah, that's real. All right, I guess I'm on their team now. This has been, all three of these have been replicated many times at this point over the last 10 years. So, one thing that sometimes comes up when I talk about these kinds of studies, and when anyone does, frankly, is, what about like the subliminal priming that folks used to do back in the movies back in the 1950s? So back then, what they used to do is they tried to get people sitting in the movie theater to do things like leave their seat, get up and go to the concession stand, and get something to drink. Right? You all know that movie theaters actually make like 90% of their money from the concession stands. The whole reason they show you movies is to get you to spend money at the concession stand. Okay? Probably the whole reason they spend previews is to give you more time where you think, I can go to the concession stand without missing anything important. So they would do things like they would put in a single frame of the movie where it would say, drink Coke. And it was so fast that nobody saw it, but they thought this is going to get people to go buy Coke. And it turns out it never worked. Never worked at all. Okay? And so the key thing in terms of making sense of these two different kinds of findings, where you can't get people to get up out of their chair and drink Coke, but you can get people to walk more slowly, if you prime them with the elderly stereotype, is that what you can do is you can take some behavior or motivation that they already have and nudge it slightly. So priming someone with the elderly stereotype won't get someone to get up and start walking. But if they already had reason to be walking, you can nudge the walking to be a little bit faster or slower with priming. Okay? In the hostility one, you have to go interrupt that person. That's what you are waiting to do. Okay? But you can be nudged to take a longer or shorter amount of time to do it. Okay? And Similarly, here with the Trivial Pursuit, you're already trying to do well, but somehow you can nudge their performance a bit up or down. Okay, so primes can't make you walk, but they can make you walk more slowly. All right, so on to the next category. We've talked about automatic perceptual processes, the way we make sense of others automatically. We've talked about automatic behavior in the last three. And now we're going to talk briefly about automatic goals. Okay, and automatic goals is an odd one because goals are things that we usually have consciously in our mind. Okay? We decide what it is I'm going to try to do. So I set a goal that I'm going to study for 2 hours tonight because I have a big exam tomorrow. Right? That doesn't happen accidentally. I have to set the goal. I have to plan for it. And that's how these kinds of things happen. So first, a little detour to get to the key study that we want to talk about. There were classic studies done in 1980 and for a couple of years right around there where subjects were asked to read a series of behavioral statements about a person, okay, things that this person did, and they were given one of two goals. They were either given the goal to just memorize those statements, and the people told to memorize the statements were told, you're going to be given a recall test at the end of this experiment. So they were told, memorize these, and by the way, there's a test later where we're going to see how many you can recall. The other subjects were not told to memorize, and they were not told that there was any test later in the experiment. Instead, they were just told to form an impression of the person they were reading about. So you read, 20 statements about John, and you're either trying to get an overall sense of John and form an impression of what kind of person John is, or you're doing something non-social, trying to just memorize the content. And of course, you would think that the better strategy to be able to do well on a memory recall test later would be to just memorize the content. But it turns out that people do better on that memory test, half an hour later, if instead they had the social goal of forming an impression of this person. Okay, this is a pretty striking finding in and of itself. You do better not by memorizing, but by thinking about just forming an impression of that person. Okay? And there's some cool data over the last 5-6 years that actually starts to flesh out why this is true. There's sort of dedicated systems in the brain for sort of impression formation, and those are really good at integrating information about other people, and they do better than the systems of the brain that are involved in kind of non-social memory formation. So this is a replicated effect. It's been replicated probably 10 times between 1979 and 1982. John Barge, the person that I've talked about with many of these studies, ran a study where half of the subjects went through an exact replication of the last study I showed you. So half of the subjects either got the explicit memorization goal or the explicit impression formation goal, but the other half of the subjects were primed with a goal without ever being given an explicit goal for how to read the sentences. So some of those subjects were given memorized primes where they had to do a sentence unscrambling task. I was somewhat prepared is what you would pull out of this. You'd throw away the word memory and go, I was somewhat prepared. But in the process, you're getting primed with the word memory or primed with the word impression. He has an idea. You're throwing away the word impression. So you get primed with one of those. You read the same behavioral sentences from the Hamilton study in 1980. And for everyone in the priming conditions, the test at the end is a surprise. So here the memory subjects do not know that there's a test at the end. And here's what they found. Conscious goal, non-conscious goal, didn't matter. You basically get the exact same pattern whether you're primed consciously or told explicitly to have a memory or an impression formation goal. It also turns out, and this is just a little note down here, it's kind of just an extra piece of information, that if you're, for instance, primed with the memory goal or some other implicit goal, and you end up then doing a task that goal is relevant for, if you don't do well at the task, you will be in a worse mood than if you hadn't been primed with that goal. So these are called mystery moods, and that's because your mood is kind of being affected as if you had a conscious goal and you failed at it, but you don't even know you have a goal because it was primed outside your awareness. Okay. All right, so on this next slide, you just need to know X. This one, X, X. This one, you need to know everything on the slide. X. No, I'm kidding. You didn't need to know anything on that slide. So all the X slides, not on the exam. I want to spend a few minutes discussing some other sort of implications of thinking about automaticity for our psychology, for our behavior, how we understand others. Where does automaticity come from? Why does it matter? Well, automaticity typically comes in two flavors. When we're not talking about pure reflexes that are built in, there's unintentional or incidental practice that can generate automatic responses. So most of us are exposed to sort of cultural examples again and again and again from when we're infants throughout our lives, and we come to just experience our culture as the way we see the world. We incorporate these cultural norms into our experience automatically, and this is done unintentionally. Little babies aren't saying, oh, I'm going to pay attention to those cultural norms, but not these. Okay? For the most part, the same is true with development of your native language. Okay? And then there's other cases, though, where we intentionally practice at something in order to develop automatic habits or responses. So if you ever took a typing course, okay, you start out doing stuff in a very controlled way where you go J, 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 K, 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 right? Or whatever it is that they did with you. And over time, it becomes automated, and we do that on purpose. When we learn our habits for sports and learning a musical instrument, or if we want to get ourselves into the habit of studying or eating a certain way, these are all things where we can consciously choose to develop automatic habits. Okay. Automaticity matters. We've talked about this a whole bunch. It matters because situations tap into our automatic associations and activate them and affect our subjective construals, and they do this without our consent, without our awareness. That's what those priming studies are doing, a lot of them. They're changing the way we see Donald in the situation in front of us. When we have the description of Donald, the prime activates certain associations for us and makes us more likely to apply those ways of understanding Donald than some other way. I'm not going to talk about this, so ignore this. Pretend that's a big X right there. Moral responsibility. Okay. It's generally part of our legal system, although it gets really tricky. But it's generally part of our legal system that we hold people more responsible for things that they do in a willful, conscious, reflective way than things that happen automatically. Okay? So, a murder committed in the heat of the moment, crimes of passion, those are considered lesser offenses than someone who's sort of a cold-blooded killer who sort of plans what they're going to do for days or months and then goes and enacts it. Okay? That's the legal system saying, we don't hold people as responsible for impulsive behavior that would be difficult for most people to control. Okay? And it gets a little tricky, because when we look at others, a lot of what's automatic for them, to us, can look quite intentional. Imagine that other people are having their goals automatically activated for them by cues in the environment, so they don't even know these goals are being active. But to us, they just look like they're engaging in goal-directed behavior. Okay? So this is a very tricky thing. We have these empathy gaps for why is someone else behaving the way they behave. Is it because they chose to, or is it because something is subtly influencing them without them realizing why? Right, so the question was, wouldn't you be more dangerous if you're the kind of person who, when you sort of get riled up, automatically you go and hurt someone or kill someone or something like that? If you do that repeatedly, sure, that becomes a concern. But if you think about the person who goes and plans a murder, right, that means they've thought through the morality of this, and they've decided it's okay for me to go do this. Whereas someone in the heat of the passion who does this, or someone who, for instance, is a drunk driver, right? We all think that all three of these are terrible ways to do it, but we also think that the person who's sort of going out and choosing people to kill and plotting to do those things to them, we think they're going to do more long-term harm than someone who, found their spouse in bed with another person. How often is that going to happen? Hopefully not too often for most people. And so, that happens once, you get crazed, you do something terrible, and you're going to be punished. It's not like, oh, well, that's okay. But that's a lesser offense than someone who said, I'm going to kill someone every month this year. So let's see. I pick that person, I'm going to stake them out and figure out what they do every day. And right, there's a level of moral corruptness that we hold that person to. And we say they're more responsible. Is there a question in the back? No. Okay. So that's the end of the automaticity lecture. So now okay, so today, for the rest of today, we'll be talking about conscious awareness and controlled processing. So, by a show of hands, how many people think that hamsters are conscious? Right? I do. Right? They have some awareness, some experience. Right? How many people think they're conscious? How many people think hamsters can think? Right? Few people. And then I think the interesting question for our purposes here is, are these different questions? Okay? And the answer is yes, but usually when people disagree about the answers to these two questions, they're actually referring to two different things. So there's two different kinds of conscious processes. One we tend to share with all or most other animals, and the other seems pretty unique to humans. So if two people are disagreeing about whether hamsters are conscious, one of them probably means, the one who thinks the hamster's conscious probably means something like hamsters have some level of experience or awareness. That when they eat something tasty, it actually tastes good at some level for them. They're not just little machines with no experience whatsoever. And when a person says hamsters aren't conscious, typically what they mean is hamsters can't do math. Hamsters can't think about stuff. So, there's these two kinds of consciousness, and they go by different names. So I try not to stick too much to sort of forcing you to know any one of these, but there's kind of a collection of names that get used to talk about this first kind: immediate experience, pre-reflective consciousness, that is, conscious experience that you're not reflecting on, so it's prior to reflection, pre-reflective. William James referred to this famously as the stream of consciousness, which is just sort of flowing by at all times. This is where kind of our basic perception comes in, our basic visual perception, but also our basic social and emotional perception. And it feels like when we're talking about immediate experience or pre-reflective consciousness, it seems like we're just experiencing reality directly. And I think the same kinds of processes can influence us non-consciously as influence our immediate experience. So I actually think, so Freud really thought the big difference was between conscious and unconscious processes. I think that's actually largely false. I think the big distinction that's important is between processes that are involved in immediate experience that we don't reflect on, and similar things can be conscious or non-conscious, but they're going to sort of work in the same way. And then the other half of the equation is what we call reflective consciousness, or thought. Okay? So you can kind of think of this as psychological processes related to the experience of reality versus the experience of thought. Okay? And so typically, reflective consciousness involves some kind of reflection on the stream of consciousness. Okay? So you've got the stream of consciousness going on. So right now you're listening to me talk, and for a lot of you it's just sort of going through and not really sort of being thought about at all. It's just taking it in, listening. I'll listen to it later on the podcast or something. And then every once in a while, I might say something where it doesn't make any sense at all. And then suddenly you're jarred out of that pre-reflective mode, and you're suddenly going, wait, what's that about? And you're thinking about what I just said. You're thinking about what you were just experiencing pre-reflectively in the stream of consciousness. And then as soon as we finish that, we go back to not thinking anymore. Right? So you're all, is it for this week or for last week? It's for this week that you're all reading mindfulness, right? So this is similar, although not identical, to talking about this in terms of mindless taking in of experience, and reflective consciousness is related to mindful sort of reflections on experience, thinking about what's happening to you, thinking about your emotional experience, and so on. I've said the word about several times, and this is a key component of reflective consciousness. Reflective consciousness has the quality of aboutness. When we think, we always think about something. There is no thinking in the absence of an object of that thought. Okay? Reflective experience, the stream of consciousness isn't about anything, it just is. Your experience just is, and then when you stop and think about it, those thoughts are about your experience, or your thoughts can be about what you're going to do next week, or what somebody else is going to do tomorrow. But they're always about something. It's a key component of reflective consciousness. Okay? So when psychologists talk about reflective consciousness, typically the term we use to discuss it is controlled processes, or controlled processing. And we use this because typically when we're talking about reflective consciousness, it feels like a process that we are personally in control of. Okay? This is all pretty automatic. Okay? I just feel like I'm experiencing reality. I'm not in charge of how that reality comes in, right? You're not choosing to see this background as white. That's just what's out there. Except your brain is contributing to that, but you experience it as just something out there, and it's not under my control. But controlled processing, reflective consciousness, are things, if I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next week, it's usually because I've decided to think about what I'm going to do next week. It's under my control. I can stop and say, I'm going to start thinking about what I need to do right now. So we call those controlled processes. And as I said before, almost all animals have this kind of conscious experience. Okay? Now, we don't know this for a fact, but everything points to it. They certainly behave in the same way we do as a function of having our stream of consciousness. Most other animals also respond very similarly. But either only humans have reflective consciousness, or maybe a couple other animals have a little tiny bit of it. But that's arguable. It's possible that we're the only ones that have any of it whatsoever. It's a little up in the air. Yeah? Of an immediate experience? Me listening to your question as you speak. Or everyone else listening to your question as you speak. Or you hearing me snap. Right? You didn't do anything to hear me snap. It just appeared in your experience. And then the next thing follows it, and the next thing follows it. And it's everything all at once. Right? So I'm looking out at you, and literally I'm seeing all of you at some level all at once. But reflectively, I can usually only choose one thing to reflect on at a time. I can reflect on the whole class, but then I'm reflecting on you as a group. Okay? Reflective consciousness is not good at taking in a lot simultaneously. So, the stream of consciousness is kind of like, and this is just a metaphor, but it's kind of like the film projected on a movie screen. Okay? So the movie screen and the projection of it, it just keeps going. It goes on from one bit to the next bit to the next bit, and it isn't aware of itself. And it's just going to keep going. Okay? Reflective consciousness is more like the movie critics, okay, who think about the movie, who replay small segments of it over and over in order to analyze, evaluate, and consider alternative ways that they might have ended the movie or things like that. Okay? And we do this to ourselves. We have both of these within each of us. And we use them in different ways at different times. So the outputs of pre-reflective processes or immediate experience feel like they happen to us. The outputs of reflective processes feel like something we do. Reflective conscious thoughts are the only things we know of in the entire universe. In the entire universe that are intrinsically about anything. Okay? If I hold up a book and I say, what is this book about? You can say, oh, well, that's a story about blah, 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 blah. It's not intrinsically about anything because there's a bunch of little strange markings in there that only mean anything if you have human beings with conscious reflective capacities to convert that into reflective thought as they read. In and of itself, it is not intrinsically about anything. If you have a book that's written in English and everyone who ever spoke English died off, that book would no longer be about anything. It's only meaningful in the context of people who can interpret the symbols. But when we think reflectively, it is intrinsically about something other than itself. Thought is about other things. Of course, your thought can be about your thoughts. So it can sort of loop back on itself. But when your thoughts are about your thoughts, your current thought is about a past thought. Okay? When you think about your thoughts, right? If I think about what I just said to you, because you all just said, what? Right? I'm now thinking about a thought I had 10 seconds ago. Okay? That has now passed into the background. It's part of my memories. It is not the ongoing thought itself. This isn't that important for the class, so I'm not going to get hung up on this. Yeah? Right, so the question is reading pre-reflective? That's a great question. It's a combination of both. So, and we're going to come back to this later in the lecture, but driving, typing, reading is a combination of both. So there's elements that are effortful and controlled, and there's elements that are incredibly automatic. So if I took away all your immediate experience, you could no longer read. Okay? But if I only left you with immediate experience, you couldn't read either. And, more importantly, you couldn't learn to read. And that's the key thing. So without reflective experience, nobody can learn to read. Once you've learned to read, you can prime people without sort of using their reflective experience. But to get complex meanings, and I'll show you an example of this either at the end of today or tomorrow, to take sort of multiple words and string them together, you need people to be able to sort of consciously reflect on those. So if you're capable of learning something, does that mean it's reflective? No. So, I mean, lots of learning starts out reflective. When I learn my lectures, right? So I write my lectures and then I don't look at them for a year and I have to sort of relearn them each time I give them. That's always going to involve reflective processing each time, right? But I'm sort of trying to load it into memory so that it'll be a little bit more familiar when I give it. But there's other things that you can learn without reflective thought whatsoever. So there's conditioning. Right? So if you take basic reinforcement and learning type classes, there's conditioning that you can do with animals that don't have any reflective processes. And humans have those mechanisms as well. If you eat certain kinds of things that make you sick, your body will automatically come to associate sort of a negative response to those without any reflection on your part. So both kinds of learning occur. Definitely. Yes. So let me put it a different way. Pre-reflective processes are typically automatic. Okay? Now, non-conscious processes are also typically automatic. Okay? But I don't think non-conscious processes are that relevant in everyday life. I think it's pre-reflective conscious processes that end up driving most of what we do, and they're automatic as well. But both of those kind of operate under the same principles, whereas reflective processing operates under different principles. So what's the difference? The question is, what's the difference between pre-reflective and automatic? So automatic refers to certain characteristics of how you perform a behavior. So if you can do it without interfering with something else, that's automatic. If you can do it without sort of awareness of why you're doing it, that's automatic, right? We have those characteristics associated with automaticity. Pre-reflective experience is about the way you are experiencing the world. Okay? It's not, so I think that they are very much overlapping, but one is about sort of the capacities and the constraints on that behavior. Does it interfere with other thinking and so on? And the other is, how do you experience? Do you experience it as just out there in the world as reality? Or do you experience it as that's something that I'm actively doing mentally in my mind? So what I won't ask you on an exam is tell me the difference between the two. Because I think they're a whole lot more alike than different. And what I'll say is most people in our field talk about automatic and controlled processes. But coming from a background in philosophy, I think I'm just motivated to talk about pre-reflective and reflective processes because they have to do with our actual experience of what we're doing. And I think that our experience gets lost when we talk about automaticity and control sometimes. But it's a great question. These have actually been the best questions I've gotten about automaticity and control in the last several times that I've taught this. So they're really good. Okay. So we already talked about this. Are hamsters conscious? Yes, if you mean pre-reflective experience, immediate experience, stream of consciousness. No, if you mean can they think reflectively. Okay. Everyone clear on that? Right? So if two people are disagreeing about whether a hamster's consciousness, it means they're using different definitions of consciousness. One is using the definition of reflective consciousness, one is using the definition of pre-reflective consciousness, and in all likelihood, the two people don't really disagree at all once they get clear on their terms. Okay. So, now we're going to talk more explicitly about controlled processes, because this is how psychologists typically talk about reflective consciousness. Okay. This list here are the properties associated with controlled processes. And if you go back to the lecture on automaticity, you'll see that there's another list just like this that's the exact opposite. Okay? So controlled processes are intentional. Automatic processes are not intentional. Okay? So if you know the list for one, you probably know the list for the other. Just reverse it. Controlled processes involve awareness. They interfere with other controlled processes. So you can't memorize a phone number and think about Shakespeare's sonnets at the same time. They interfere with each other. They require effort to engage in. And they tend to, although not uniformly, but they tend to be linguistic. So automatic processes tend to be more perceptual, okay, in complex ways, but perceptual. Control processes tend to be more linguistic. That's not a definite characteristic all the time, but a tendency. So we can take the example of counting backwards by sevens from 16,358. Okay, it's a really great example of controlled processes. Why? Because you will never find someone doing this without having the intention of doing this. No one ever accidentally finds themselves counting backwards by sevens from 16,358 or any other number, right? Nobody does this without knowing they're doing it, right? None of you are currently counting backwards by sevens and not knowing it. It's never happened in the history of the world. It will never happen. If you're doing it, it's going to interfere with your ability to do other controlled processing things. It requires effort, which is why we don't like doing it very much, right? Effort is equated with, I'd like to stop, please. And it's linguistic. You're using words or sort of symbolic representations in order to perform this task. And controlled processes are experienced as my mental work under my control rather than reality out there. If you are doing this, you experience it as, I am subtracting by sevens. I have chosen to do this, and it's my mental work, and I am responsible for the next number that comes up in my mind. It's not like seeing the screen as white, which is just something that happens out there in the world. Okay? And this is kind of a redescription of some of the other characteristics, but controlled processes are remarkably special. They are the reason why we can sit in a building like this, because people can build buildings, architects can plan things and create heating and air conditioning and all these things and electricity. None of that happens without controlled processes. Okay? It's why we're not living in trees, unquestionably. Okay? But it's a remarkably limited resource, which means we can only do one thing with it at a time, which means it has a real kind of oversimplification to it a lot of the time. So what it can do is bring together novel thoughts that we've never brought together before and combine them in new and interesting ways, right? So you can imagine I'll give an example that one of my postdoc uses in her research. If I say motorcycle carpet, okay, there is no such thing, but you can imagine what that might be, and you're not all imagining the same thing. So you're sort of putting them together in your head and combining these representations in novel ways, and that's one of the special things that controlled processes do for us. Okay? But they're limited in all sorts of ways that also get us into trouble. And we tend to overvalue these. Okay? We tend to think that anytime someone can explain why they've done something using linguistic controlled processes, we somehow buy that more than someone who says, I just have a feeling. I just have an intuition. Okay? And that's because if somebody tells you the work that went into their controlled processes, you can duplicate it in your own mind. Okay? But if someone just tells you they have a feeling, you don't know what went into that, and it's hard to duplicate for yourself. It doesn't mean that the controlled processing answer is better. It just means it's something that we can duplicate the logic of in our own mind, and so we tend to trust those more. So I want to talk about controlled processes in a couple different contexts that social psychologists think about it. Okay? And actually, it's going to come up throughout the rest of the quarter. But as I said, I think about automaticity. There's some great examples that come in other lectures that I don't want to cannibalize for this one. But so these are the things we're going to talk about, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on each of these. So this one is the first one, the conscious logic of social judgments. This is one of my favorites. I look forward to this part of lecture every year. I taught this in the spring, and somebody gave me such a hard time about this. And anyway, so everyone knows what this is? Franz Hall. Yeah, Franz Hall. And so you go in right here, and there's, 3 elevators there. Okay? And what most of you guys do is take the elevator to there. And then all of us who work up here, we look at you. Say, oh, what is wrong with those people? Okay? Even worse, the people who are here and take the elevator to there. Those are the worst. Okay? Now, actually, and you should know, graduate students and faculty all talk about this. Okay? When you're on the elevator with a professor, there was a student that was on the elevator just yesterday, and I bet she's in this class, but I bet she won't identify herself, who got on the elevator and went from 3 to 4. Okay? Well, she was trying to go to 3 to 4 because the elevator was actually going down, and so then she had to wait. But she was trying to go up to 4, but she had to wait for it to go down to 1 and back up to 4, and all I could think is, oh, great, because tomorrow I'm going to be talking about her, and so the key thing about this, okay, is not so much whether you should or shouldn't take the elevator, although you shouldn't. Okay, stairwell here, stairwell in the back over here. Okay, good for your legs. You know, it lowers cholesterol to take the stairs. There used to be signs in the elevator saying, "Why not take the stairs?" You know, Brad Pitt would. There used to be signs all over trying to get people. It never worked. Okay. The key thing is, though, is that it's not so simple as whether people take the elevator or not. Right? I have this very complex logic. Okay. So, for instance, it is okay, of course, to take the elevator from 1 to 8, and it's okay to take the elevator from 8 to 1. It's okay to take the elevator from 1 to 4. It's okay to take the elevator from 1 to 3, but less okay to take the elevator from 3 to 1. Right? So I sort of have this rule in my head of, okay, going up 1 floor or going down 2 floors, you should take the elevator, and it's modulated by when it is. If it's 10 o'clock at night, take the elevator, because nobody else is going to be affected. But if it's 2 p.m., you're holding up other people, especially like if you're going from 5 to 6 or whatever it is. Okay? Now, the key thing here is, so 2 parts of this is, A, this is a public service announcement. Okay? But the real thing that's relevant to class, right, is my elevator logic is complete bullshit. Right? There's no basis for it. You know what the basis for it is? Is that I don't want you on my elevators when I'm trying to go up or down. Right? That's the reality of it. Right? If I work on the 4th floor, if I worked on the 6th floor or the 7th or the 8th floor, I bet my elevator logic would look different. Right? I'm sure it would. Suddenly, instead of just being upset at people who take the elevator from 1 to 2, I'd be upset at people who take the elevator from 1 to 3. Because, I have to go higher. I might even be upset at people who take the elevator from 4 to 1. But you know what? I'm not, because I take the elevator from 4 to 1. Okay? And I look at people who get on the elevator and do this, and I evaluate them, even though I probably shouldn't. And let me give you an example. Sometimes people get on the elevator, and they take it 1 floor because they don't actually know where anything is in the building. Okay? How do you know? Someone gets on the elevator wearing a suit. Okay? Nobody else wears a suit in Franz Hall. If they're wearing a suit, it's the first time they've ever been in Franz Hall. But my first thought is always, God, what's wrong with this person? And then I have to think effortfully and say, you know what? Maybe they don't know where they're going. Maybe, they just walk in, they see the elevator, and they don't know any better, unlike all of you who should know better. But there's other times where people won't be able to sort of be seen just visually in terms of, whether or not they're new to the building or whether or not they should be taking the elevator. See, I have a disease called gout. And gout basically makes your feet really hurt every once in a while. Now, I haven't had an attack in 7 years, but when I did, I would have a week every 2 months where I literally could not stand on one of my feet. Okay? The pain was crazy insane. Okay? William James had gout too. We're bonded in that sort of way. But when I had gout attacks, I took the elevator 1 floor. You would think that I would then extend the courtesy of imagining that other people might have reasons for taking the elevator 1 floor. But I don't. Okay. So the upshot of all this, as far as this class is concerned, and enough trying to get you to take the steps, the real upshot of this is people generate logic for making sense of other people in all sorts of crazy, screwy ways, and it can be really complex, it can be reportable, it can be a controlled process through and through. It doesn't make it accurate. It doesn't make it true. But it feels more valid because I have a system that I can put into words. Okay. So when we use conscious social logic to make sense of other people, it feels valid, we feel validated, it doesn't mean it's true. So our conscious social judgments can be just as inaccurate or even more inaccurate as our sort of stream of consciousness stereotypes and other things like that. All right, I want to give you one more example of sort of tortured conscious logic. I used to show a video for this, but it's way too long of a video, and I can get through the point more quickly, and just recommend you go see the movie. How many people have seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Yes. Still not enough of you. Go watch it. What's wrong with you? You're here right now, and you could be watching that. Okay. There's a scene, okay, where King Arthur, someone playing King Arthur, it's not a documentary, walks up to this small village, and he sees sort of the person running the small village, kind of the wise lord of the village, talking to a bunch of really dirty peasants who come up and claim they have found a witch. Okay, now she's not a witch. You can see from this picture right here, they've put a big carrot on her nose. Right? But they want to believe she's a witch, and so they go through this process of trying to figure out whether she's really a witch or not. Okay? And so the wise guy in this small peasant village from, the Middle Ages says, well, let's figure out if she's a witch. And we can do that by logic and deduction. And he says, what do we do with witches? And the whole chorus of dirty peasant people say, you burn them! Right? And then he says, exactly. And what else do we burn? And they give a couple different answers, but then eventually they come up with wood. And he goes, exactly. Does wood float? Yes. What else floats? A duck. And so he ends by saying, so logically, if she weighs the same as a duck, then she's a witch. Okay? And the woman then goes, yeah, that seems reasonable. Right? She goes along with it. And they end up finding she weighs the same as a duck, and they burn her. They don't show the actual burning. But this is just, a really hyperbolic example of our logic on the surface seems sensible, but it doesn't mean it actually is sensible. You won't need to know this one for the exam, but I just think it's an example for just demonstrating how tortured our conscious logic can be. All right. Now, we've already seen this study before in slightly different form. This is the false consensus effect. You can ask people, would you wear a big sign around a college campus that read, eat at Baja Fresh for $25? Okay? And you can ask people, would you do it, and what percentage of other people do you think would do it? And this is Lee Ross's famous study from 1977. And what you find is that the people who say, I would wear the sign, think other people would wear the sign. The people who wouldn't wear the sign think other people wouldn't wear the sign. Okay. Now, we've already talked about one of the reasons that people sort of make this mistake in their judgments about what other people would do. Okay. We've talked about how our subjective construal and our projection of ourself into that experience, right, can bias the way we think other people would behave. So subjective construals involve, how did you imagine the event? Some people imagine that they're walking down in Westwood at Baja Fresh, and that makes people go, oh, God, I might see people I know. That would be terrible. And somebody else might imagine, being at a college campus, Baja Fresh that's 50 miles from here. And if they imagine that, they go, what's the big deal? $25, that's pretty good. Right? They've imagined different events. But let's say somebody knew I'm probably prone to those kinds of subjective construal errors, so I'm going to try to be more scientific about it in my own mind. When we try to be scientists in our own mind without actually going out and physically collecting the data, we refer to these refer to people as being naive scientists. It doesn't mean naive in the sense of you don't know anything. It's actually a terrible name, but what it really just means is it's kind of what we as non-scientists, which I am the rest of the day when I'm not actually teaching in here. So all of us are non-scientists most of the day. We kind of act like scientists and sort of run little experiments in our head to try to answer questions and make sense of other people. And so the naive scientists could say, well, the question is, what would others do? Okay. And so if I don't want to get into trouble, I shouldn't think about what I would do. Let me actually try to think about what other people would do. And the problem is that we sample a population of people in our head, and we say, okay, well, let me think about what Jim would do. Let me think about what Fred would do. Let me think about what my brother would do. And then we say, oh, well, all three of them would wear the sign. So I guess most people would wear the sign. And the problem is is that the people who are accessible to us in our minds, the people who come to mind easily for us, are the people we know and the people who are more like us. Okay? So we may accurately imagine what those people would do. We may reflect on them and accurately characterize what they would actually answer if given this situation, but then we generalize it to everyone, and those folks aren't representative of everyone. They're more like us. Okay? So in this case, there's no intentional bias. We're not trying to get the answer wrong. It just so happens that the information that's accessible to us is information that's biased, because it's going to be information from people who are more similar to us. Okay? We just don't realize that our sample is biased. So you're doing conscious, effortful, logical work, but you don't realize that you're doing it on flawed data. No, I think it's a controlled process. It's a controlled, logical process where you're saying, all right, I'm going to come up with 10 people I know and think about what each one of them is going to do. I'm not saying everybody does this when they show the false consensus effect, but you could, right? You could say, I'm going to think of a list of people, figure out what each of them could do, and you could do it exactly accurately. But what we don't realize is we've sampled the wrong people to figure out what people in general would do. Okay? So it's a controlled process, but it's kind of the wrong controlled process because it's being applied to data that isn't appropriate. Okay? We'll come back to this when we talk about decision making. There's a phenomenon called attribute substitution, where you're basically asked one question and you accidentally answer another question because you don't realize that you're not answering the question that's really being asked of you. We'll come back to that, though, in a number of weeks.
The example you gave on the very first day of class, where you talked about how people look around the individuals around them to see whether or not they should do something.
Right.
That's kind of an automatic.
Yep. Yeah, when people look around, so on the first day with the finger-giving experiment, when people look around, that is probably largely automatic, and people have no idea that they're doing it. Incidentally, I was at a conference this past weekend where one of my teaching assistants from like 4 years ago was at the conference, and I told him that like I put on the suit and nobody gives the finger anymore, and he was flabbergasted. He was like, "Everybody gives the finger." I'm like, "Not anymore." He's like, he couldn't. He's like, "I cannot believe that's what would have happened," but that's what happens. So let me just give you one example of why this kind of biased sampling is really a problem and getting to be a bigger problem in our society. So this is what the country looked like in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected president. And what this map shows is how different counties in America voted in the 1976 election, with the more red reflecting a sort of higher proportion of Republicans voting in that particular county. Actually, it's districts, not counties. So the more red it is, the more that district had a Republican vote, and the more blue it is, the more they had a Democratic vote, and the more purple it is, the more it is sort of right in the middle, mixed. And so what you can see is in 1976, except for some strongholds of blue down here and a little bit of red up here, we have a pretty purple country back in 1976. What does that mean? It means there was probably a 50-50 chance that your neighbor had different views than you did about politics, about cultural issues, about things like abortion, religion, all these different things that are hot button issues for us and determine whether we watch Fox News or MSNBC. Right? Back then, you spoke to people and went to school with people and worked with people who held those different views, which were a good reality check. But then watch what happens as we go from 1976 up to the present. So here's 1988. Here's 2004. Here's 2008. Okay? What we see are much more dramatic, and you could see it better if you could see it on my computer. The contrast isn't as good up here, but you see much more dramatic pockets of intense red, intense blue. Okay? This means people today are now living around people who share their same views, which is comforting in a lot of ways, but it also means that it's very hard for the people here to appreciate the experiences of the people here, and of course vice versa. right? We're increasing the empathy gaps that we have because we don't know as many people who have different views from us. Okay? And I think that's very potentially dangerous to the national identity because we have less and less that we really share in a coherent way, and a lesser appreciation of other views being reasonable views that our neighbors have, our coworkers have, our friends have, and so on. And then here, this is 76 versus 2008, so you can see them right next to each other. Right? It's a pretty dramatic difference. Okay, so moving on to the next form of sort of consciously controlled processing of interest here. And now we're going to talk about introspection or introspective thinking. Okay? So if I asked you to imagine on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you like vanilla ice cream? Okay. You come up with an answer, and then we can say, well, could you be wrong about your answer? Right? You can't be wrong about your answer of how much you like vanilla ice cream. How could you be wrong? If you're wrong, who's right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. How much I like vanilla ice cream is entirely determined by how much I feel like I like vanilla ice cream. Okay? That turns out completely false. Okay? That's not true at all. You're going to read Dan Gilbert's book in a few weeks, Stumbling on Happiness. Okay? And it turns out that how much you think you're going to like the ice cream that you're about to get, okay, is only mildly related to how much you will enjoy it once you get it. So there's a distinction between wanting something, which is how much you'll think you'll like something, and liking something. So our theories of how much we'll like something are not always consistent with how much we actually do. Okay? I'm not saying you're actually wrong about what you came up with on vanilla ice cream. It's quite possible that you're right. But there are various cases in which people make mistakes where they think, I know exactly how it's going to feel, taste, whatever, to do X, and then they get there, they do X, and they go, well, that's not what I thought it was going to be like. Right? So, your favorite movie from 5 years ago, you go, that's my favorite movie. I love watching that movie. I'm going to go watch that movie again. Okay? Then you watch the movie again, and you're like, oh, not as good as I thought it was. You start to see flaws in it that you might not have seen before. It looks a little dated, whatever it is. Right? So our predictions are not always matched up with our actual experiences. Now, okay, we can then say, well, if you're not always right, could somebody else know your right answer better than you? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So I used to give this example with myself as a baby, but it turns out my son is exactly the same way. So I will use him instead of me. So every night, 7:30, time to take a bath. And every night, no way. No way, Mommy, Daddy, no way. Okay? That is his way of saying, I don't like baths. Okay? Scale from 1 to 10, baths, minus 50. However, once he's in the bath for 5 seconds, you can't get him out. Okay? He loves baths. He just doesn't know that he loves baths. Right? And I would say that's something wrong with him, but I was exactly the same way as a little kid. There's lots of things where we're like, no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. And then we do it and we're like, oh, that was fun. Now, he's wrong about how much he likes baths, but I'm right about how much he loves baths. I know exactly how much he likes baths. And it turns out that the people around us often know us and our preferences better than we do. And we'll come back to that later, but what I want to talk about now is something that I think is pretty paradoxical, which is can introspecting on your preferences, thinking about what you like, can it lead you to make worse choices, choices that you will regret? So thinking about what you'll like leads you to choose things you'll actually like less than if you didn't think about what you like. So there was a very, very famous paper by Richard Nisbett and Tim Wilson. Okay, Richard Nisbett and Lee Ross went to graduate school together. So these are like two of the big shots over the last 40 years of social psychology. They kind of ruled the world for about 20 years. And when I say the world, I mean the very small world of social psychology. And this paper is arguably the most important paper of the last 40 years in social psychology. I think you could argue that, Milgram from the 60s is more important. We'll get to Solomon Asch later in the class. Maybe that is more important. But I think this one, and certainly for me, probably the most important paper of the last 40 years. And it's a review paper. It's not a set of experiments so much. But the key thing is that they're addressing this topic of telling more than we can know. Okay? So this relates to hypothesis 3. So they talk about some little mini experiments they did that demonstrate the theme of the overall paper. And I'm not going to go through the overall paper, but I'll give you sort of one of these little demonstrations. They would bring people up to do sort of a consumer choice task. So, it's out on the street, and you sort of set up a little booth. You have people come up, okay? And you have them somehow, I can't remember how, you have them do a first task where they see words like ocean and moon, and lots of other word pairs too. But one of the word pairs that you get is ocean and moon. And that's really critical, because the second task people are given is, which detergent do you prefer? Okay? And it turns out that you get a biased response towards people saying Tide, which is related to ocean and moon. Okay? If you don't prime people with this, people are 50-50 on which of these they like, at least back in 1976 when they did this. But if you prime people with ocean and moon, they say they like Tide more. Now, that's not so surprising in the context of everything else I've already told you, although this study came before any of those other studies I told you about last lecture. But here's the really interesting part. When asked why they chose Tide, they all came up with reasons that had nothing to do with the real reason. Okay? They said, well, my mom uses Tide. That's why I like it more. Right? Or it's the most well-known, or I like the box. Okay? All bogus. I mean, it's not that it's not true for anyone, but these folks have no idea that they've been influenced by this priming episode. And it would be one thing if they just were influenced by it. But they're not only influenced by it, but they're confidently coming up with completely bogus reasons why it is that they chose Tide. And they believe them. Right? They're not like, well, geez, I was actually influenced by those primes, and I don't want to say that, so I better come up with something else real quick. That's not what's happening. They actually now think that's why they like Tide. But it's totally bogus. Now, this paper was Nisbett and Wilson. Wilson went on to do all these really great studies on introspection. And this is the one that addresses the issue of whether or not introspecting on your preferences can lead you to make bad choices. So this is Tim Wilson. He's at University of Virginia, and he brings people in, or he brought people in. This was done a long time ago. And he shows them 2 art prints. Sort of the kind when you're outside Ackerman, they have all those big books you can flip through to pick your art prints, to try to create your identity on the walls of your dorm room, right? That sort of thing. Yes, I was one of those too at one point. So you've got a Monet here, and then you've got like a Garfield cartoon with a little caption on it. Okay, and so people are shown these two, and they are going to be asked to answer how much they like each of these 2 art prints. So they're going to have to give a rating, a number, to how much they like each of them. Okay, and half of the subjects are told, before you tell us your rating of how much you like the art print, okay, we want you to think about your reasons for the answer that you're giving. So we want you to think about your reasons for why you like or don't like each of these. So half of the subjects are introspecting, and half of the subjects are just sort of giving their gut judgment without introspecting. So in the control condition where they don't introspect, hopefully, not surprisingly, people say they like the Monet more. Okay? Most people would say Monet, better art than Garfield, with a silly caption. And you get that very clear here. But if you have people introspect about their reasons first, it changes dramatically. Now, they don't really prefer one or the other, and the preference for the cartoon goes way up. It goes way up when you have people introspecting and generating a list for why they like each. And here's the real kicker. So they said, okay, you're going to get to take home whichever poster you said you preferred. So we're going to give you an art print of the one you said you preferred. And so there's, in all conditions, there's some people who like this more, some people who like that more. It's just the mean is very different here. But so you get people who, say they like either better, and they get a copy of that, and they take it home. And then 2 weeks later, Wilson and colleagues emailed the subjects. I'm kidding, actually, because there was no email in 1993. They used a carrier pigeon to send a note over to the students in their dorm rooms, and they said, okay, well, we got your they didn't say this. So they had gotten their preference on the day of the experiment, and now they said, tell us how much you like the art print you currently have, that you now own. Okay? And what you find is that the people who had chosen the Monet on day one, they say, yeah, I still like the Monet just as much as I did before. But now 2 weeks later, the people who had chosen the cartoon say, I chose badly. The cartoon sucks. Okay? These folks are basically saying, I made a mistake. I wish I had taken that other one. They're changing their preference. And so we don't have to say, oh, well, they made a bad choice because art critics would say Monet is better than the cartoon. We don't have to say that at all. All we have to do is ask them 2 weeks later, and they tell us, yeah, I didn't make a very good choice back then. So here's the big question. Why does this happen? Why does introspecting on your choice lead you to make a choice that you yourself will admit to regretting 2 weeks later? Okay? What do you think? Why does introspection do this? Any thoughts? Second-guessing our best choice, but what about introspection causes that?
It's because anything that you can give an argument to seems valid. It's the same thing with the elevator.
Right. So there's something about putting it into words that makes an argument seem valid, and this is sort of one of the tricks of the experiment, it's easier to put things into words about a cartoon than it is about sort of abstract art. It's harder, unless you're an art critic and you really have the vocabulary, it's harder to generate things to say about this one and easier to generate things to say about this one. So then you find yourself with a surprisingly balanced list of things written in front of you. Okay? And so what happens here is you are substituting the list that you've made for your own genuine affective response. And you've been tricked, essentially, into making a list that you'll believe is valid, but it's really just because it's hard to put certain things into words. And so here's the way to think about this. It's as if you've handed your list to somebody else, and that's all they have to go on to guess what kind of preference you have. And if you hand someone else a balanced list, sort of 3 pros on each side of the list for each, art print, they'd say, oh, they probably have a balanced view of those 2 pieces of art. And what we're doing when we're introspecting and thinking introspectively is that we're kind of guessing our own preference the same way. We're not just sort of zeroing in on our gut response and saying, aha, I know it. If you get someone to think introspectively, to reflect introspectively, we start taking what we can generate in words and language, and we say, that must be an indicator of my real preference. So introspection does not necessarily reveal sort of privileged personal information. Maybe it does sometimes, but it doesn't always. Sometimes we take that information we generate, however it is we generate it, and we evaluate it just the same way we would evaluate it if somebody else told us that information. And that can get us into lots of trouble. We're going to continue with this. Wait, hold on. No lecture on Thursday. Just want to make sure everyone hears that. I will be away on Thursday, so I will see you all next Tuesday, but I will have office hours tomorrow, 12:30 to 2:30. Meditation is quite controlled processing, actually. It's an interaction of the two, to be sure, but I don't think it's so simple as saying sort of Eastern stuff is automatic. It's a very cultivated automatic process that takes 20 years of practice, but there are lots of things that can never be automated. There's some things there's just no way to ever automate them. Sure, so you can introspect where you just sort of go, what's my gut, and that's it. But if you start introspecting about why you come up with the reason, sometimes those reasons will be the